This is terrific tonight that we have an amazing panel and a discussion on screenplay adaptations. And I also want to thank the Writers Guild for doing this, Writers Guild East. We have Richard Wesley, Ruth, Jhabvala, Douglas McGrath, and my great friend Israel Horovitz. My first experience with adaptations was I was sitting in a movie theater and a movie came on called 3 Days of the Condor, Robert Redford. And after the credits came on, it said, based on a novel, 6 Days of the Condor. And I remember the audience going, jeering and saying, we got gypped. And I said, I wonder what that meant, an adaptation. And according to Writers Guild statistics, 65% of movies that are shot are based on source material. Could you guys respond to that? Why original screenplays are, less?
Well, it's risky. I mean, look what movies cost. It's a business, and it's riskier to not have a successful source novel or source play or source event where there's already public interest.
Also, too, a novel or a play has gone through its own set of, it's already been vetted, it's been tested, by which I mean a lot of the problems have been worked out. You have different things to figure out in adapting it, but if you start with just your empty screen,
you have to think, what's the end going to be? How am I going to get there? Whereas with source material, the end is there. You know you're going to get there.
A lot of times a screenwriter will work on adaptation because he or she has been hired to work on adaptation, so that a film studio has already decided that this would be a film. So then there's the other side of the coin where you find something that you really love and you set out to adapt it and to talk somebody into doing it. Quite really different circumstance.
My first question to Ruth is, you adapted your first novel.
Household.
Could you tell us the experience of how that all came about?
Well, I wrote the novel in 1960, and in 1962, at that time, very young men showed up, Ismail Merchant and James Ivory, and they said, would you, they wanted to make a film, and they wanted me to write the screenplay of The Householder. And I said, I've never written a film. They said, it's okay, we never made one either. So that's how we started.
So Ruth, when you wrote the novel, did you imagine it as a movie ever?
Never, absolutely never. I had hardly seen a film because I was living in India, and all we got was sort of the scrapings of the worst Hollywood films, and I just didn't see any.
So what was the first thing you did when they said, we want to turn this into a movie?
Well, I took the novel and I read it, and I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. Actually, it was. At least, I wrote the dialogue like it was in the book. I thought that'd do fine. But afterwards, I found it didn't do well at all. You cannot take the dialogue from a book and plonk it down in your screenplay. You have to do things to it. So that's where I learned of my own novel, really.
Then you went on to do E.M. Forster novels.
Oh, much later.
Much later?
Yeah, much later. After that, we did a film called Shakespeare, which was an original, and then another 6 originals before I came to the first adaptation, which was a Henry James novel, The Europeans.
Yes. Douglas, you tackled Emma, and you directed it.
I did.
What drove you to say, I love this book?
Well, it was the first Jane Austen novel I'd read, so when I was reading it, I just took it on face value as being a sort of light, romantic, and slightly frivolous piece of writing at the beginning. And then there's this extraordinary scene in the middle of the book where Emma is at a picnic with her friends, and she makes a joke at the expense of a spinster in the town. And being Emma, she thinks she's phrasing it so cleverly that everyone else will get it, but it won't hurt the spinster's feelings. And of course, it deeply wounds the spinster. And it's a terrible moment because she's hurt this person who is beneath her socially, so it's an unforgivable mistake just on those grounds alone, because she should never treat someone who's technically beneath her in that way. So she has made fun of her at this picnic. and everyone knows it, and everyone condemns her, not verbally, but they disapprove of her having done this. Most of all, her friend Mr. Knightley disapproves of it. And what I loved about it is that all of a sudden you think you're here, you think you're on this shiny surface right here, and you think the whole book's going to be on that shiny surface right there for the whole book. And all of a sudden you find out there is a depth of feeling that for which you had not been prepared in just the right way, meaning it's the most wonderful surprise, and you think, oh my God, this is about so much more than I ever thought. And as a person who has more than once made the mistake of saying the wrong thing in a way that I thought was so smart and clever, and then it turns out to be not so smart and not so clever, and it ends up hurting someone's feeling, I thought how beautifully Austen captured that mistake, and also the desire to correct the mistake. You know, if you've ever hurt someone's feelings inadvertently, you feel sick about it. And that's the moment I thought, I love this book. I love this book.
Israel.
I was just thinking how much adaptation I've done in my life. It's really, I don't think of myself as somebody who's done that much, but it's just tons and tons and tons. I did a film called Sunshine a couple of years ago. It was with Ralph Fiennes, and Istvan Szabo directed it. And my agent called me from London, and she said, I have a really interesting project. I think you'll be really great for this project. Istvan Szabo, and I didn't know his work at all. And she said, well, how can you not know his work? And I said, I'm sorry, I've been busy. And so I looked at Mephisto, and I didn't really love it. And then I saw a film called Colonel Radel. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but you should make a note and rent this film. It's astonishing. I said, yeah, I'd love to work with Szabo. I think it'd be a great honor. And what came to me was about an 800-page miniseries that he had written for television that was way too expensive for television, didn't get made, and the film company wanted to do a feature film based on it. So I took all of this work, and the agent had said to me, this will be 6 months. It took 3 years. I'm glad I did it because I think it's a great film. I think it's a really beautiful film, but it was an astonishing amount of work because all 800 pages had enormous meaning to Istvan Szabo. They were torn from his life and his life story. So I really had to not only boil down the story and find something that had its own dramatic life, but I also had to deal with him and convince him that could be cut. I can tell you when you look at 800 pages and somebody's going to make a movie out of this, you just wonder why you said yes.
Like so many, of my colleagues here, most of the adaptation that I did was a novel to a screenplay, or a book, a nonfiction piece into a screenplay. Native Son, of course, was the adaptation of the Richard Wright novel, and there I was wrestling with a lot of things. I had to really be convinced to do the project. Native Son was never one of my favorite novels, even when I was a teenager. I didn't know anyone like the central character, Bigger Thomas. Even the hardest knuckleheads that I knew on the street corners in Newark, where I grew up, they were nothing like Bigger Thomas, and so I was just sort of like, no. But eventually, I did say yes, and then the next big thing was, well, how do I start to get into this? And then I got into the novel. It's structured in 3 parts: fear, flight, fate. And the first section, fear, that's an idea. That's a thematic platform on which I can base the entire screenplay. The idea of fear, and what are the different emotions, and what are the different psychological states that fear can put a character into. And that gave me the end that I needed in terms of trying to turn the screenplay into a faithful representation of what the novel was, because I decided to keep Bigger Thomas in a state of fear throughout the screenplay itself.
When I got hired to adapt the first draft of The Third Miracle, I remember the execs flew me to LA and they said, "We love your first draft," sat me down and said, "We got a question." I said, "Sure." They go, "Can you turn this into The Exorcist?" And I said, I know The Exorcist. I love The Exorcist. I wish I wrote The Exorcist, but The Third Miracle is not The Exorcist. So yeah, that happens a lot. And I couldn't believe they paid so much money for the book and hired me to write it and then asked me to turn it into something it wasn't.
I was hired to adapt a Norman Mailer novel, and I had 3 little kids, and I really needed the money. And at some point, I gave the money back. And I can tell you, one of the hardest things in life is to give the money back. And I couldn't do it. And the longer I worked on the book, the more I hated it.
Was that because what you're talking about is you needed to get into that mutability?
Well, film is like, the form of film and the form of our dreams are very similar in a way. And that particular dream was a nightmare to me. The people got uglier and uglier, and I thought, this doesn't represent me well. I just can't do it.
So did you not like the book, or you couldn't find a way to make that book into
I think the first reading of the book, I probably didn't like it, but it was such a good job that I thought, I could like this, I can make this work. And the more I worked on it, the more I discovered that I couldn't feel good about myself. And so,
Douglas, have you ever had that?
Not quite like that, but after I had made Emma, someone wanted to make Vanity Fair. This was before Mira made it. And they said, but we want to modernize it. And I hadn't read it, so I thought, well, let's see. And so I start reading it, and and it's utterly delightful, and it's quite satiric, and it's completely interesting, but it is set in the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And when they said modernize, they didn't mean to another nearby war, to the Napoleonic Wars. They meant right till now. And so I'm reading, and they're getting more and more into the Napoleonic Wars, and people are being sent to the front, and characters are being killed, and I kept thinking, how's this going to work? And so I just stopped, and I thought, I need some clarification. So I called the woman from the studio, and I said, I'm loving the book. I'm just loving it. I just have one question. You say you want to modernize it. Do you mean now, modern right now, like right after we finish talking now? And she said, oh, yeah. And she said, I mean, within the last few years. And I said, and the Napoleonic War, what are you thinking we'd use for that? And she said, well, the stock market crash. Bye.
I think it should be said that most novels should be printed on the title page. It should be printed never to be a major motion picture. It would make our lives a lot easier.
Yeah, that would help.